Hi, I'm Brian. This is Brian Reads to You, where I'll read everything from the classics to the not so classics, poetry, music, and more. I hope you enjoy. Today we're going to be reading Princess Sophia by Brian K. Eddy, with illustrations by The Horses. Chapter 4 Not Welcome. The black stone walls of Castle Vigilance were just as dark and mirrored as the cliff they had passed that morning. It was tall and thin like the mountain tops above them. Two towers, one looking north and the other south, rose from the base, reaching into the clouds. A red fire glowed from the battlements over the main gate. There a shadow, 10 foot tall, loomed between the flame and the North Pizzanians. "Who are you?" boomed a deep voice from the shadow. Pine needles fell from the trees and the very rocks shook. "You are not welcome here. Go back." For someone who had been shaking in his boots just an hour before, Calvin was now possessed of a courage he could not explain. Maybe it was finding his cousin. Perhaps it came by banishing his fear earlier. Or just maybe he was ready to begin acting like a real king. He stood up in his stirrups, took a deep breath, and bellowed back, "I'll answer your insult with a question of my own. Just who are you to be standing in my castle, telling me to go away?" The shadow demon appeared surprised by his challenge. It quivered a little and seemed to shrink just a bit. Then it gave out a loud, piercing shriek that tore through the air. A second call from high above echoed in the pass. Calvin and Donovan looked up to see a jet-black dragon with fiery eyes and smoke seeping from its nostrils land heavily on the pinnacle of the north tower. It screamed again and shot a blast of reeking brimstone from its mouth toward them. Neither of the men moved an inch. They were in no danger at this distance. However, it was nice to know what they were facing. "I said, be gone," boomed the voice again. A ball of bluish flame appeared in the center of the shadow and just as quickly flew forward at incredible speed. It landed between them with a thunk and licked at the hair on their horses' fetlocks. It was a fire arrow. "You're no demon," Calvin shouted defiantly, drawing his sword. "I've faced worse against the Bacaman pirates around Shipwreck Cove. Show yourself before I introduce you," and raised his sword threateningly, "to Pizzanian steel." The shadow stepped sideways so that the bonfire now shone upon a thin, 5-foot-tall, red-headed figure. Its voice no longer boomed, but was clear and sharp as any blade. "I am Sophia, princess and heir to the kingdom of shadows, and this is my castle." She threw a fist forward and her dragon launched into the air, shrieking. Clouds of fire burst in every direction. North Pizzanian knights held the respect of all warriors throughout the lands. Donovan the Bold had earned his nickname through countless battles, and though Calvin was not yet fully trained, he had spent his entire life learning how to fight. After all, kings were expected to lead their people in both peace and war. As if planned all along, they leapt from their saddles, whipped the broad shields between them and the oncoming beast, forming a wall of protection for them and their horses from the dragon's boiling belch. Red and green flames exploded around them. Calvin grimaced and leaned in, though driven 3 steps back by the force of it. Even Donovan gave up a foot of ground. The dragon passed close over their heads and snapped at Neighbor's ears. He ducked, but the valiant horse was more than just some beast to ride upon. With a furious neigh, he kicked hard upwards with his hind legs and caught the monster a terrific blow to the knee. In pain, the dragon flipped over in the air and crashed hard into a stand of oaks. They snapped under the beast's weight, and it disappeared in the shadow. The heavy sound of it rolling down the mountainside filled Calvin's heart with joy. "Now to deal with you, princess," he muttered. He and Donovan must have had the same thought as, without a word, they each grabbed their bow and quiver, faced the castle, and advanced in wide, separate paths. Sophia could not shoot at them both now, and for a moment she wasn't sure which of them was the more dangerous target. Donovan had the longer range, but Calvin was far more accurate. The knight stopped short and began to drop arrows all around the princess. She easily knocked aside any close ones with her own wooden shield, but it kept her busy long enough for Calvin to rush in under the very shadow of the walls. Once he was out of her sight, Calvin was able to prepare his most potent weapon. He pulled a large glass ball from his bag, about the size of an orange, and yanked out the stopper. Inside was a pink liquid that smelled a bit like asparagus. Into this he poured a red powder from a vial on his belt. Instantly they began to boil and smoke. Calvin shoved the cork back into the bottle's neck, counted to 6, and then threw it as hard as he could, way, way, way up, and on to the battlements next to Sophia. The bottle crashed against the wall near her head and exploded. A huge cloud of silvery blue smoke covered her in a second and rolled out over the edge of the battlements. Then came the smell. Imagine wearing the same pair of socks during the hottest part of the summer for a whole week without washing them. Then use those socks to wipe up a rotten egg. After it dries, add some sour milk that has sat out in the sun, and finally let your dirty, drooly dog play with them for a while. You would want to wear those socks again, rather than breathe in Calvin's stinky smoke bomb. He tried to run. Honestly, he did. However, even knowing what was about to happen, Calvin couldn't keep out of the stench. His lungs felt like they were on fire. His eyes popped out of his head. The hair in his nose curled up into tiny ringlets. Finally, he emerged from the gas, coughing and spluttering. He could hardly see for the tears in his eyes. Donovan was riding toward him with Neighbor in tow. Calvin scrambled as best he could onto his faithful horse's back, and they moved far enough away to be safe from the noxious vapors. "That's probably done her what for," said Donovan, with an odd smile on his face. I hope so," wheezed Calvin. "Imagine her claiming my castle, princess or not. I bet she isn't." Just then came a mighty rushing wind from above, driving the smoke up and away from them. It rose, thinned, and disappeared. The forgotten dragon let them know he wasn't finished with this battle. It looped once in the air and then dropped like a missile toward them. "Time to go," bellowed Donovan, and turned his horse quickly. Calvin needed a few seconds to understand that they were now in retreat. Why were they running? However, a fearsome dragon bearing down gave him more than enough reason to follow the knight. They didn't stop until 4 turns of the road and several miles lay between them and the castle. Calvin trotted up to Donovan, breathless from the hard gallop and still feeling the effects of his own smoke grenade. He looked at his cousin in amazement. The knight was laughing. "Donovan, what is so funny? We've got to go back. We can't let this shame happen. We are knights of North Puhzanya." Between chuckles, Donovan managed to blurt out, "Because that is about how it has happened every year since your father brought me up here. Oh, the dragon is new. That was a surprise. Understand, my prince, North Puhzanya has been chased away from the Castle Vigilance every summer solstice for years uncounted. Calvin was beyond himself in outrage. But, but, she's just a girl! Chapter 5. A Clever Plan. It was a very long, quiet ride back to their home in North Puhzanya. For once, Donovan had no idea how to help the young prince. Riding, shooting, sword, and spear, all these were easy for him to teach. However, words were not his strength, and for the first time in his life, Donovan felt helpless. For Calvin, this was the most embarrassing day ever. It started so grand. The greatest warrior he had ever known turned out to be his own cousin. They faced a dragon, adventured the secret of Castle Vigilance, and then a girl, younger than himself, bested them. A girl. True, she did have a dragon, and she was in the castle, which is always an advantage. But still. Then Donovan called retreat, just as they were about to win. And what was all this about North Puhzanya being chased away like this for years, centuries even? The shame was too much to bear. Calvin was miserable. The mountains had shrunk to small lumps behind them before Donovan tried again to reason with his lord. Calvin? Yes, Donovan, he answered in a mumble. Has your father ever told you why we always lose in that battle? Calvin perked up. Maybe there was a reason for it, some explanation that would take away his dishonor. No. What did he tell you? It is a royal secret, only passed on to the heir of North Puhzanya. Over time, most of the details were forgotten. All we know is that the Kingdom of Shadows and we built the castle together. The great Puhzanya himself designed it, and the ruler of Shadows gave of their best materials and workmen. They planned a great celebration for the longest day of summer, the solstice. However, the Shadow Kingdom claims that when the day came, Puhzanya betrayed them. We deny it, of course, but who can say the truth after so many years? Ever since, we have sent an envoy. Sometimes we have gone in peace, trying to make amends. Sometimes in war to enforce our claim to the castle. Every year we are rebuffed. The only order given by our king, always given, is to do no harm to any person from the Kingdom of Shadows. If we cannot fight to win, then we will certainly lose. 1,300 years later, it has become a bit of a joke. We go up and claim the castle. They shoot one arrow at our feet. We run away. Everyone has a good laugh until the next year. I don't know, Donovan. That's pretty dumb. I think Princess Sophia really means it. Yes, fire arrows and a live dragon haven't been part of our little play for a long, long time. Perhaps you got under her skin a little? I hope so, said Calvin defiantly. Not allowed to hurt her? He asked with a sideways glance. Nope, Donovan answered flatly. The prince screwed up his face into a scowl that would frighten even a dragon. I'll take that castle, and I don't have to hurt her. I just need a clever plan. Calvin felt much better all the rest of that day. He was going to show that snotty girl who really owned that castle, and he had a whole year to do it. During July, Calvin swam in the sea, sailed his boat, and plotted against Princess Sophia. In August, he made a treaty with North Puhzanya, fought ruthless pirates, and plotted against Princess Sophia. September and October saw him overseeing the harvests, laying in food for his kingdom, riding neighbor to check on the other castles, and plotting against Princess Sophia. During the dark winter months of November, December, and January, he set aside all the unimportant matters of the kingdom so he could concentrate on plotting against Princess Sophia. With the spring sunshine, he threw open the doors to his castle and invited all the people to enjoy a grand party, which he skipped so he could plot against Princess Sophia. And the warm summer days rolled in to find him finishing the details of his grand, clever scheme against Princess Sophia. This was going to be the most brilliant plan ever, and she would be sorry for standing against the crown prince of North Puhzanya. Calvin decided to set out on his birthday and head straight for the secret road. Winning that castle back would be a mighty achievement. However, despite the many adventures in his past, he thought it might be a good idea to ask advice of the two smartest people he knew, especially since this time he would be going alone. Baird the magician hobbled into view, leaning heavily on his staff. "Baird, are you finally getting too old to serve?" Calvin asked jokingly. Nobody in the kingdom knew how old Baird really was, only that he remembered the king, before Calvin's father, King Kent. "Nay, my lord, I twisted a knee some time back. I will be whole soon enough." The old man clapped his hands together, rubbed them merrily, and asked, "What can I do for you, my liege?" "Baird, I have an enemy, a bold, strong, fierce enemy." "Do tell." "They are holding one of my castles against me, and I wish to take it back." No worries at all, my lord. Your armies are strong, your generals are smart. I can give you a dozen clever plans to ensure your victory." "Who is your enemy? Which castle?" Calvin leaned in close, almost whispering. "The Princess Sophia of Shadows is her name, and she occupies the Castle Vigilance." Baird answered without even having to think. "No hope, not a chance. Give up now and go enjoy the rest of the summer. I heard that Chef has created a new flavor of ice cream for your birthday, Whippleberry." "I'm serious!" bellowed Calvin angrily. Baird remained perfectly calm. "So am I, my lord. That castle belongs to—" The magician stopped mid-sentence and gazed past the window out to the sea, as if he could read something in the waves or hear whispers on the wind. He stroked the long curly hair of his beard and wiggled his ears thoughtfully. "Though it may be time," he said to no one at all. "Yes, he could be the one." Baird snapped to attention and looked closely at Calvin's face. "Perhaps, finally. We've waited so long for the prince who could heal this wound." Calvin felt a little weird, as if Baird were talking not to him, but about him, to a crowd of invisible, long-gone wizards. "I will help you," he finally announced, and shuffled out of the room, cackling like some tiny, green creature of legend. Calvin stared after him, dumbfounded. "Well, what help was that?" he called after Baird, but by now Calvin was very much alone. Calvin's frustration with the wizard had grown to the point of actual anger by the time he left the castle doors and headed out the grand front path. "Who was he to talk to me like that?" Calvin fumed. "He's just a servant, after all. I'm the prince of the realm. I deserve more respect. Practically an adult." In the distance, he saw his mother once again working in the gardens. He strode up behind her and said in his most magisterial voice, "Constance, I'd like to speak to you." The queen, kneeling on the ground, sat up. Her entire body became rigid as she dropped her small shovel and slowly turned her dirt-smudged face toward her son. "What did you call me?" she whispered in a steely tone tinged with poison. The prince stepped back as if stung by a bee. His tone changed abruptly. What I mean was, hi, Mother, how are you doing? I see you're working in the garden again. That looks like fun. Would you like some help? And may I talk to you about something? I love you." The queen's jaw jutted forward an inch and her eyes sharpened to needles. What evil plan are you up to, Calvin? Not evil, Mother, not evil, he said quickly before a wicked smile spread across his face. Clever. With you or your father there is no difference, she said, a grin finally breaking the hard look. Tell me your plan, and don't leave out any details. After a full 20 minutes of breathless excitement in which he talked about pulleys and winches, how to make rain, the characteristics of the common newt, why ice cream melts, and where he could get 6 cats, Calvin finally finished explaining his clever plan. Constance had to agree that it was brilliant, if a bit complicated. There was no doubt in her mind it would work. However, she had no desire to go to war with South Puhzanya, or to have to eat stewed frogs twice a week, both of which were sure to happen if Calvin followed through. So she offered an alternative. Son, have you shared this plan with Baird or your father? Calvin looked at the ground and did not answer. I see, she replied. And why not? Because they wouldn't like it. Why? The prince glared at her defiantly, then said in a mocking voice, Father always says, talk when you can, fight when you must, never start the war, end it as soon as possible, show mercy always. But the Shadows have held our castle for 1,000 years. It's ours, and they don't own it. And she shot arrows at me, Calvin finished with a rush of fury. Queen Constance gazed at the boy. He wanted so badly to prove himself a strong man, wanted to be a leader. He wants to be a good king, she thought, so like his father. I can trust him to do what is right. She smiled at Calvin, gave him a hug, and then looked deep into his eyes. I'm sending you up to Castle Vigilance now. I want you to think about your brilliant plan, then ask yourself, what does royalty want more than gold and silver, more than castles and land? When you can answer that question, then you will know what to do. As far as Calvin was concerned, the adults were no help at all. His mother's advice to think about it was nothing more than he had been doing for the last year. He'd been thinking and dreaming and plotting against that snotty little girl for so long now that he couldn't stop thinking about her. And the wizard? He was clearly insane. Nothing he said made any sense at all. So Calvin saddled up Neighbor, and with mounting excitement began the 3-day journey to Castle Vigilance. His anticipation grew and grew until it burst out of him. Everyone has a secret talent, something they love to do, but are kind of afraid to show, just in case they aren't really that good. For Calvin, it was singing, and out here, miles and miles from anyone, he shouted for joy. I rode out on a mighty quest to show the world which land is best. To Vigilance, and take the castle back from her, that proud and haughty red-haired girl. Oh, Vigilance, you're mine today forever. In the little garden at the foot of the mountains, he gathered all the horse-heart fruits he could, and then began his long upward climb. Neighbor was happy to stretch his muscles, and they practically flew. In less than half a day they were making the last turn on the castle road. As the dark twin towers broke into view, Calvin was inspired with another verse of song. Spied the fortress dark and tall, my victory come, her claim did fall. At Vigilance, my clever plan you may suspect was to show her no Calvin threw his head back, sighed heavily, and drooped in his saddle. All thoughts of victory and glory fled. His mother had done it again. Destroyed his clever plot by making him think. She was right. He knew how the verse had to end. He knew what he had to do about the castle. And he didn't like either truth. Not one bit. Chapter 6. A Castle for Two. The dejected prince let down his cage of cats, poured out the essence of newt, ripped up the letter to Bubby, king of South Puhzanya, and steeled himself to do the horrible, shameful, embarrassing task that must be done. Neighbor remembered all too well what had happened last time they were here, and did not want to move any closer. Nevertheless, he obeyed Calvin and started forward at a brisk walk. They were no more than 100 paces from the castle when an expected fire arrow landed at their feet with a thunk. "Who are you?" boomed a deep voice from the shadows. Pine needles fell from the trees, and the very rocks shook. "You are not welcome here. Go back." Calvin dismounted carefully. He gazed at the castle before walking over to the arrow still alight in the soft dirt. He drew it from the ground and blew the flames out before dropping it lightly into his own quiver. He then moved to just 50 paces and called back. "Hail, Sophia the Brave, Princess of Shadows, heir to the throne, Horsemaster, Archer Supreme, Dragon Tamer, rightful owner of Castle Vigilance." He almost choked. "Your Highness, I am Calvin, Prince of North Puhzanya. May I approach and speak with you?" Surely this idea of his mother's would work. He had acknowledged her royal status, praised her skill, gave up all claim to the castle. He had deliberately moved so close that even a poor marksman could have dropped a feathered shaft through him. In other words, he had shown her all the respect and honor due to royalty. The only question was, would she respond or kill him where he stood? The answering silence was deafening. Calvin could feel it pounding in his ears. He waited a full minute before taking 3 steps forward. Nothing happened. Calvin maintained his composure. He stood back straight, shoulders wide, and eyes firmly on the balcony above the gate where Sophia had challenged him before. After all, Calvin was a prince and heir to his kingdom as well. There was no reason for him to grovel. Then an idea struck him. The prince strode forward deliberately until he was under the very shadow of the castle walls. He then removed the bag from his shoulder, lifted out 3 of the horse hearts, and clicked his tongue. Neighbor trotted up quickly and nuzzled Calvin's cheek before happily biting into one of the fruit. "Sophia," he said calmly, "I have brought a gift for you and your noble steed. Horse hearts from the very tree your ancestor presented to mine so many centuries ago. We have cherished and nurtured that symbol of peace, in the hope our lands might once again be friends." He lifted the fruit out as if she were standing directly in front of him. A loud neigh of unmistakable delight sounded from one corner of the castle, followed closely by the most magnificent mare Calvin had ever seen. She was silvery gray with huge, intelligent eyes. From the sense of joy about her, one would think she could dance a jig, jump over the moon, and run forever. The mare pranced up to Calvin without a fear, a shower of glistening sparks trailing behind. Up close, she was perfection. In a trance, he reached out to scratch her nose, but fast as lightning she lifted it up and popped the bottom of his hand. One of the horse hearts flew into the air, and she caught it in her mouth effortlessly. Then, snickering loudly, she danced sideways up to neighbor and greeted him as a long-lost friend. From the dark castle doorway, Sophia proudly moved into the light. The last year had transformed her from a proud little girl into a proud and haughty young woman. Calvin was mesmerized. Her long, bright red hair was still in a tight braid down her back. The strong bow was hanging from her shoulder and quiver within reach. On her left forearm was a round wooden shield perfect for fighting on horseback. In her left hand was a long, frightfully sharp dagger of purest steel. Sophia strode directly up to Calvin and set the tip of her weapon into his throat. "If you ever insult my companion again, they will be the last words you speak." Credit Calvin's bravery that he did not even flinch. However, his deeply bruised pride and self-control were sorely tested. There were many, many things he wanted to say, none of which were wise when an angry woman had a knife. "I have always understood," he replied without showing any of the very real concern he felt at that moment, "that the Shadow Kingdom valued bravery and honesty. I have offered you both." Sophia's dagger moved back an inch. He continued, a bit more forcefully. "Is it your people's justice to condemn the stranger for not knowing your ways? I do not know what companion you speak of, but I have certainly offered no insult. Why then do you threaten?" Calvin saw the hesitation flicker in Sophia's eyes and knew he had scored a point. Yet, rather than answering him, she directed the next question to her horse. "Andromeda, do we forgive this," looking him closely up and down, "man?" The silvery mare stepped over, took a long, deep sniff of the prince, whacked him in the side of the head playfully with her nose, and then sidled backwards while nodding. Sophia looked downright disappointed. "Andy, are you sure? I really want to kill this one." Andromeda shook her head vigorously and stepped between the royals. The princess peeped over the mare's back and spat out, "Fine, we forgive you. This time, but never let it happen again." She turned so quickly that her braid swung up and around to slap Calvin in the cheek. He was getting very tired of being hit in the head, but his time would come soon enough. Sophia had moved all the way to the castle gate before turning. "Well, are you coming or not?" For the first time, Calvin understood what it felt like to be a peasant. Without a thought, he obeyed her command and walked toward the dark entrance. Just before going inside, he called out to neighbor, "Try to be friendly, will you, boy?" "But not too friendly," yelled Sophia from deep in the shadows. The main room of Castle Vigilance was large and round, with doors at both the northern and southern ends. In the center of the floor was a spiral staircase dropping down into darkness. The ceiling was 20 feet above their heads and ornamented with carvings. Calvin quickly recognized the story of Mother Earth and Old Man Sky directly above the north doors they had just entered. The walls and ceiling told the history of old Pacama until the days of Harold Nostrum. At the very south end, above the opposite doors, a mountain arose from the destruction of war. Its summit reached the very center of the ceiling, and meeting there was the dragon of North Puhzanya, entwined with the horse of the Shadow Kingdom. Calvin could not tear his eye from it, while Sophia looked at him steadily. "Do you know your history?" she asked snidely. "As well as you do, I'm sure," he replied acidly. "Then tell me why the dragon and the horse meet at the mountaintop." "Because our peoples built this castle together." "And why do we fight over it now?" she asked angrily. Calvin looked straight into her eyes and without a hint of shame said, "Some say that Puhzanya betrayed your king, but—" "Not a king!" she hissed furiously. "My land has never been ruled by a king, and never shall. Queens have led this land by right and royal descent. I am the 72nd daughter from Sophia the First, heir of Harold Nostrum, and rightful ruler of all the 7 lands." The prince was very surprised at this. He was never told that old Harry Nostril had had a daughter. But Harold had a son. He ruled Pacama after the war. He wasn't the eldest child. Sophia should have been placed on the throne once Harold was exiled. If true, then this very pretty young lady was his rightful queen. Calvin did not want to think about either of those things right now. "Some say that Puhzanya betrayed your queen. We do not believe it. 1,300 years is a very long time to hold a grudge. That is why I have renounced my claim to the castle. I want there to be peace between us." Sophia did not seem to believe him, but nodded curtly anyway. At least she didn't have a dagger at his throat. "That is also the story passed down from our lore masters. We know Puhzanya broke his oath. On the very day this castle was to be dedicated, he sent an emissary to proclaim his cowardly and dishonorable intentions. He would not attend the celebration. He would not meet with our queen to discuss why. Puhzanya maintained his claim to ownership of this fortress, and worst of all, he renounced all friendship with my land." Calvin was shocked. "But surely you know why he did this. What was the nature of his oath?" Sophia turned her acid green eyes upwards into Calvin's face, but there was disappointment there. "I was hoping you knew. It was a personal covenant between monarchs. Sophia only spoke of it once. Her commands were, never to harm a citizen of Puhzanya, and he was never, ever to have the castle. We have kept guard ever since." "An honorable duty, which you have kept well," he replied kindly, and now he meant it. For the first time, Calvin thought he saw thankfulness in Sophia's eyes.
I hope that was fun. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. Tell your friends. Talk to you later. Bye.